Greetings, traveler through time. Now close your eyes for a moment and let yourself drift to the heart of Gaul around the year 930 of our calendar, when Europe still existed as a mosaic of faith and fragile power. I am the old historian, keeper of medieval tales. If my stories bring you rest, then my voice has done its work. Now tell me, where does your listening echo from? The orange glow of twilight paints the modest palisades of the village of Aubépine, a settlement of stone and timber nestled among softly rolling hills. The scent of peat smoke and fresh rye bread hangs heavy in the cool evening air, promising warmth and sustenance after long hours in the damp fields. It's that peculiar stillness that night always brings, a gentle veil of peace settling over the day's labor. The slate roofs of the sturdier houses, dark and heavy, catch the last rays of the setting sun, while the packed earth of the village square still holds the mild warmth of the day, a tactile contrast to the sharp breeze descending from the surrounding woods. You can hear the faint crackle of logs burning inside hearths, and the distant bleating of sheep being led into their pen. Simple sounds marking the unshakable rhythm of life back then, a rustic symphony of endurance and continuity. Here, every sound and scent carries meaning, signaling safety, order, and the quiet assurance of another dawn lived in the same cadence as generations before. As darkness deepens, the lengthening shadows of trees on the horizon begin to merge into thicker, mysterious shapes, and a quiet vigilance stirs within the villagers, an instinctive awareness of the night's unknown. The small chapel bell dedicated to St. Eustace tolls its slow, solemn notes, cutting through the mist that rises from the nearby river. It's a sound that invites reflection and family closeness. Life here in Aubépine is cyclical, governed by light, by the seasons, by the church, and by nature itself, each heartbeat synchronized to faith and necessity. Atop the hill stands the austere silhouette of Castle Valerian, the seat of Count Theodoric, lord of these lands, a man whose word meant life or death to his peasants. Its cold stone walls seem to absorb light, casting a vast shadow over the village below, a constant reminder of the rigid hierarchy that ruled the Middle Ages. Castles like this were more than fortresses. They were centers of administration, symbols of order, and sources of the few but powerful laws shaping daily life. From some cottages wafts the smell of dinner, a humble stew of lentils and leeks, filling the air with comfort and a brief sense of security in a world ruled by uncertainty. Near the communal well, a group of women disperse after filling their buckets, their low voices swallowed by the growing quiet. Night, paradoxically, was full of soft sounds, the crackle of fire, the shuffle of feet, the whisper of stories shared around the hearth. Oral tales kept history alive when written words were scarce. The crescent moon peeks shyly through a dark cloud as a group of weary men return from the fields. Their hoes and sickles glint faintly in the dim light, the smell of wet soil clinging to their coarse woolen clothes. They speak little, the exhaustion of labor being their only companion, but the silent solidarity in their glances says enough. Physical strength was the currency of survival in this feudal system that demanded much and gave little in return. Viewed under the cloak of night, the village of Aubépine becomes a small island of flickering warmth amid the dark sea of Gaul. The villagers' intertwined lives form the backbone of a world where power lies in land and protection, a mutual dependence, unequal yet essential, binding peasant to lord in a fragile balance. Inside Castle Valerian, the atmosphere differs greatly from the village calm below. Narrow windows glow with torchlight, their yellow flames casting restless shadows on stone walls. The air is heavy, not only from heat, but from the weight of decisions resting on Count Theodoric's shoulders. Thick carpets and leather chairs absorbed sound, filling the great hall with solemn stillness, a world apart from the noisy simplicity outside. Count Theodoric, a man of about 50, with a reddish beard streaked with white and restless blue eyes, sits before a massive fireplace, not for warmth, but in search of the peace that has eluded him since last night. He holds a goblet of dark wine, watching the hypnotic dance of the flames, but his mind drifts elsewhere, to the vivid, unsettling dream that refuses to fade, leaving him uneasy and afraid. Emotions a noble rarely dared reveal. That fear, that shadow within, was the seed of something far greater, about to take root in the small county of Valerian. The Count's dream was no ordinary nightmare. To his deeply superstitious medieval mind, it could only be divine prophecy, a warning of the collapse of his house and his rule, punishment for some hidden sin he could not yet name. And so the unrest of a single man, isolated atop his own hierarchy, was about to spill down upon Aubépine and its fields. The consequence of one dream, interpreted through absolute power, would soon weave a new thread into the villagers' lives, a web of prohibitions and decrees born not from logic or necessity, but from one man's fear. The peace of evening concealed the storm forming in his thoughts, silent yet inevitable. Still trapped in those morbid reflections, Theodoric shivered as if sensing the coming change. Medieval lords wielded not only political or military authority, but the power to shape reality itself through belief. Their moods could rewrite the fate of thousands. What terrified him wasn't death. It was the loss of order and control, the sacred pillars of his identity as ruler. In his dream, he saw his castle overrun by creeping purple moss and his fields invaded by tamed beasts turned wild, a vision of decay more horrifying than any enemy siege, for it represented nature and law reversed. By morning, the tranquil rhythm of the village would be shattered by the urgent toll of the chapel bell, summoning the Count's advisors for an emergency council. His private fear would soon take shape as new laws born of panic and superstition, yet endowed with the full might of feudal rule. It was an age when the line between sacred and profane, dream and reality, was thin as mist. To Theodoric, the vision was revelation, and his duty as Christian and as Lord was to act before the curse took hold, no matter the cost to his people's peace or freedom. The ripples of that decision, made in the quiet of the night, would spread outward like waves on a still pond, changing how peasants sowed, ate, dressed, and thought. The power of a nightmare would soon become the tyranny of law, a stark reminder of life's fragility under the will of one man. Outside, the cold night wind carried the Count's unspoken fears through the narrow castle windows, down the hillside, and across the sleeping fields, a silent messenger of the unrest to come. Now wait, traveller, as Aubépine's moon reaches its peak and the village drifts into slumber. Calm is only the prelude to the strangeness ahead. The tale of Theodoric and his absurd laws, born from a single night's fear, is just beginning to unfold in the dark tapestry of the Middle Ages. Let the scent of wet earth and peat smoke cradle you for now, as the Count's mind stirs in the fortress above. Breathe in the cold night air and feel the weight of centuries where fear and power walked hand in hand. The next morning in Aubépine dawned under a dense, sticky fog that clung to the village, deepening the chill and the stillness before the world had fully awakened. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and faint traces of cold ashes from hearths just beginning to stir again. It was a dim, muffled kind of morning, thick with silence, so unlike the clear light of the day before. The first sounds to break the hush were the creaking of carts dragging slowly through muddy streets and the distant ringing of the blacksmith's hammer, muted, struggling to cut through the mist. At Castle Valerian, however, the chapel bell, usually marking only the hours of prayer, rang out irregularly and urgently. The uneven tolling didn't belong to the calm rhythm of morning. It broke it, carrying unease through the cold stone corridors. That sound, repeated again and again, signaled that something unusual had occurred, something serious enough to summon the Count's trusted men. The few servants already awake exchanged uneasy glances, their footsteps echoing softly against damp flagstones as speculation began to spread. Master Ambroise, the county chancellor, an elderly thin man with a face permanently furrowed by years spent among parchments and numbers, was the first to appear in the audience hall. His woolen socks barely shielded him from the icy stone floor, and the faint scent of cheap incense, which the Count insisted on burning, couldn't hide the pervasive smell of mould, a constant reminder of the castle's slow defeat against humidity. When Ambroise saw Count Theodoric, he immediately noticed the pallor of a sleepless man, the bloodshot eyes, and the rigid, tense posture that had replaced his usual air of cold authority. The Count didn't offer the customary greeting or morning cup of mead. He went straight to the point, his voice low, hoarse, and trembling with feverish conviction. That tone was far more unsettling than anger, revealing the depth of his agitation. The Count spoke of his dream in vivid detail, almost theatrically. He described the spreading purple moss, the wild disorder of animals, and, most disturbingly, the image of his own grandchildren crawling on all fours, eating dirt. To him, it was a divine warning, a vision of his bloodline's complete dehumanization, a loss of order and nobility. He saw it as punishment for some collective sin, a lapse in the vigilance that safeguarded Christian and natural law. His duty now, he said, was to restore purity with an iron hand. Theodoric declared that the threat did not come from enemies or rebellion, but from within, from moral decay itself. To counter this prophecy of corruption, he would create a new legal code of purity and restraint, banning anything that might symbolize animality or filth. He was determined to impose artificial order upon imagined chaos, an act born of ignorance and fear, verging on megalomania. The first decree echoed through the hall, a complete ban on the color purple throughout the county of Valerian. It was, after all, the hue of the moss that devoured his castle in the dream. In his superstitious logic, eliminating the color meant eliminating the prophecy, a strange fusion of magical thinking and law-making. Master Ambroise swallowed hard, recognizing the absurdity, yet not daring to question his lord's sanity. The Count went on. All household pets, especially cats and dogs, were to wear collars made only of raw, unbleached linen. Their owners were to wash the animals' paws daily to combat the wild dirt seen in his vision. The burden of such a rule on peasants, already struggling for food and warmth, was unimaginable. Most could barely keep their own wool garments clean, let alone their animals. A third decree followed, a special tax on soft leather shoes. Theodoric claimed that excess comfort weakened both feet and character, making men crawl like the children in his dream. He encouraged everyone to wear wooden clogs or go barefoot instead. What he failed to grasp was that clogs were already the common footwear of rural life, while soft shoes were rare symbols of status. These first decrees, foolish and impractical, were only the beginning of the Count's spiral. They turned private madness into public law, transforming his dominion into a laboratory of paranoia. Master Ambroise, once trained in canon law and the 7 liberal arts, felt the full weight of irrationality pressing down, but he also understood the nature of feudal power. The Lord's will was the law. With the weary resignation of a medieval bureaucrat, Ambroise began preparing the parchments. His quill scratched against the vellum, tracing the first lines of what would later be known as the Valerian Code, a monument to fear and superstition. The smell of gall ink and the rasping of feathers filled the hall, while pale morning light fought to pierce the stubborn mist beyond the windows. The contrast was striking, the solemn ceremony of governance versus the absurdity of its content. In the village below, peasants worried about crops, rain and grain taxes, unaware that their future was being reshaped by a set of laws banning a colour and demanding daily poor washing. Thus the fear of one powerful man, fed by the superstitions of his time, was about to disturb the quiet life of everyone in Aubépine, a tiny dot on the vast map of Europe. The orders had been given, and the weight of medieval authority would ensure that, no matter how irrational, these decrees would be enforced, reshaping both the visual and social landscape of the county of Valerian. Master Ambroise, hunched over a massive oak table in the castle's scriptorium, felt the weight of the new code pressing down on him, as though every word inscribed on vellum were a cold stone laid upon his shoulders. He'd barely had time to absorb the first absurd decrees, the ban on purple and the daily paw washing of animals, when a second, more frantic summons from Count Theodoric dragged him back to the hall, interrupting his attempt to impose some kind of logic on the chaos of these new laws. The filtered morning light gave the scriptorium a sepia hue, and the faint mingling scents of parchment, beeswax, and a hint of rat musk made up the familiar perfume of that administrative heart. The Count, now slightly less pale but burning with manic energy, had spent the remainder of the night poring over ancient Roman texts and old Germanic legends, searching for precedents that might justify his growing paranoia. Ironically, the exercise only deepened his convictions. To Theodoric, the purple moss from his dream symbolized stagnation and decay, the disorder of the animals, frivolity and weakness. Therefore, his new laws, he claimed, must enforce discipline, motion, and seriousness, protecting his realm from the disease of idleness. The first law of this new wave targeted the tempo of life itself. No one in the county of Valerian was to tell or listen to any tale involving imagined journeys or fantastic legends after the evening bell. Such stories, Theodoric declared, emptied the mind of productive thought and encouraged dangerous idleness. In one sweep, he criminalized oral storytelling, the very tradition that had carried history, morality, and wonder through generations. Culture itself became suspect, as fear disguised itself as divine order. The second decree struck at stagnation. Theodoric forbade all games of dice or board play, in taverns or homes alike, calling them acts of worship to sloth. The money spent on them, he ordered, was to be used for tools or seeds, things that promoted real movement. In truth, it was an assault on one of the few joys peasants possessed after long days of labor, the communal laughter of a game by candlelight. Then came the decree that edged into the bizarre. To combat the levity of beasts, the Count ordered that any public whistling or singing must cease immediately if a bird or dog approached to listen. To charm inferior creatures with frivolous melodies, he claimed, was to invite moral decay. Master Ambroise dared to argue, softly, that birds did not understand music. Theodoric silenced him with a cold stare and a quote from an obscure apocryphal text, insisting that worldly music corrupts both man and beast alike. The next edict, attacking vanity, banned polished mirrors for anyone outside the nobility, and even nobles were to keep them covered except when dressing. To gaze upon one's image without need, the Count declared, is to turn one's eyes from the true image of God. Mirrors, rare and costly objects of polished bronze or silver, became symbols of sin. Though the peasants had yet to grasp the full weight of these proclamations, the castle itself was already shifting. Servants scrambled to cover the few purple fabrics in their quarters. The Count's hunting dogs, now bound in rough linen collars, had their paws scrubbed twice daily in cold water. The kennel master and cooks whispered that madness had settled over their lord. It's worth noting, traveller, that many medieval sumptuary laws, those governing luxury, were less about economy and more about symbolism, designed to control how each class expressed status. But in Theodoric's case, the symbolism was personal and deranged. Purple was not about power, but moss. Mirrors not about vanity, but the fear of a soul gone astray. When Master Ambroise received the final list, his hands tingled, a physical echo of dread. He would now have to draft and distribute the edicts to the bailiffs and tax collectors, the agents who would turn the Count's neurosis into daily reality for every subject of Valerian. He thought of Aubépine, that quiet village of simple workers, soon to live not by necessity or custom, but by the fevered dreams of one man. He pondered the nature of obedience in these times, how it did not depend on reason, but on authority. Under feudal law, the oath of loyalty was sacred. To question the Lord's will bordered on treason. And so, absurdity took root as order. Security was found not in justice, but in submission even to madness. As Ambrose stepped out of the scriptorium to deliver the new decrees to the scribes, he paused for a moment and breathed in the cold air. The smell of wet earth brought him a fleeting clarity. He looked toward the distant mountains, wishing that reason might still prevail, but knowing that in the Middle Ages, fear was a stronger engine than logic could ever be. The bell, now silent, seemed still to vibrate faintly through the stone walls, carrying the Count's words like invisible chains. Words soon to become punishments, reshaping the simple life of the villagers into a daily test of obedience against the absurd. News of the new laws didn't take long to descend the hill, spreading through the village of Aubépine with the unnerving speed of fire catching dry straw. The first to feel its sting was Renard, the cooper, a broad, kind man known for his laughter and for being the best storyteller in the settlement. He was the only one who could hold the attention of both children and adults through the long winter nights. His 10-year-old son, Gervais, had just been scolded harshly by one of the Count's bailiffs for humming an old tune about a talking wolf, a harmless little song now branded as dangerous and foolish. The reprimand left a bitter taste in the air. Renard felt a tightness in his chest, for storytelling wasn't just a pastime. It was his way of keeping alive the memory of his mother and preserving the invisible threads that bound the community through shared laughter and imagination. He was a craftsman of both wood and words, and to have his art forbidden by a decree born from a nightmare felt like an insult not only to reason, but to the very soul of village life, an assault on the spirit that only stories could feed. He wondered how one could possibly silence children whose curiosity was the engine of their days, and he thought of the darkness that would settle over Aubépine once the lilt of legends disappeared from the nights ahead. At Mobile's small tavern, the smoky heart of the village known for its sharp barley beer smell, the new ban on board games had an immediate and visible effect. The thick wooden table where men once gathered after work to play tabula, a game much like backgammon, now stood empty and eerily quiet, covered with a ragged cloth as though it were a corpse. The rough texture of the cold wood beneath the fabric felt like a physical echo of the Count's decree, a touch of death laid upon simple joy. Mabille mourned the absence of noise and laughter that once filled her nights. She noticed the heavy air and the drop in ale sales. Without games, men no longer lingered. She realized the law had done more than outlaw play. It had crushed the act of resting, of breathing after toil. The few coins that used to pass between players had sustained her modest income. And now she saw the irony. The Count claimed to want movement, yet he had paralyzed what little social life the village possessed. Meanwhile, the purple ban turned into a public humiliation. Ilara, the village dyer, who had spent long hours extracting a violet pigment from lichens and berries to tint fine linen for a merchant's wife, watched her work seized and burned in the square under the charge of spreading moss-borne pestilence. The villagers stood silent as the sweet, acrid smoke of burnt wool curled upward, a smell of loss and forced submission to madness. The confiscation was especially grotesque, for in much of medieval Europe, purple or deep violet was the color of royalty and clergy. Producing it was costly and laborious. Theodoric's decree then inverted centuries of symbolism, turning a shade of prestige into one of curse and contagion. The rule about washing animals' paws proved the most burdensome of all. Bertrand, the miller, depended on his large dog, Lupo, to guard the mill and keep rats away from the grain sacks. Now, each day, he wasted precious time scrubbing the dog's feet with freezing water, leaving Lupo anxious and irritable, and himself exhausted. The muddy runoff trickled between the stones like a small act of despair. The dog, once playful and loyal, had grown hesitant, avoiding his master's touch. Bertrand could feel the animal's discomfort through the rough, wet linen collar that chafed its neck. He knew the rule was pointless. Mud would return with the next step outside, but the punishment for disobedience was severe. Losing Lupo or paying the fine would cost him weeks of labor, so he complied, quietly resentful. And so, the fear of one man rippled through every corner of peasant life, in the forced silence of children, in the empty table of the tavern, in the smoke of burned wool, and in the wet, trembling paws of animals. From afar, Master Ambroise watched as irrationality took root among the villagers. The air of Aubépine, once vibrant with rustic life, grew heavy with a silent melancholy, the scent of quiet oppression. Life in Aubépine went on, of course, but beneath a thin veil of absurd vigilance. The peasants did not voice their doubts aloud. Feudal order had taught them that complaint was useless and dangerous. Obedience, however blind, remained the safest path, even when it meant surrendering reason to the fears of a restless lord. Castle Valerian, once a place of rigid routines and formal silences imposed by etiquette, had grown even more oppressive under the weight of Count Theodoric's fear. The air itself seemed heavy, charged with an unspoken vigilance that smothered even the smallest gestures of spontaneity. The Count, utterly convinced that his decrees were saving the realm from a foretold catastrophe, devoted himself with manic fervor to the creation of new laws. He spent most of his days shut inside his private study, consumed by what he called the signs of dehumanization. He had withdrawn from his advisors, surrounding himself with piles of parchments on animal morphology and the symbols of corruption. Ancient texts he barely understood, interpreting them literally and often absurdly. The air in his chamber was thick with the scent of cold sweat, melting candle wax, and the sharp tang of iron gall ink used to jot down his feverish ideas. He rarely touched any object without first examining it suspiciously, searching for supposed traces of degeneration in its texture or color. Theodoric's newest obsession centered on movement. He had convinced himself that his grandchildren's crawling in the dream symbolized spiritual and social decay, a lack of elevation and dignity. Thus he concluded, the entire realm needed to move with upright discipline and measured grace to counteract the prophecy. From that belief sprouted yet another wave of decrees, laws designed to regulate how people walked, stood, and interacted, turning ordinary gestures into performances of obedience. The first of these banned anyone from climbing stairs or platforms with more than 4 steps in public, claiming that such height fostered an undeserved sense of superiority, and that falling from it symbolized a collapse of order. The rule was a nightmare for craftsmen and builders. In Theodoric's warped logic, elevation was a privilege reserved for the throne and its symbols. Anyone who physically rose above the ground was, metaphorically, rising against his authority. The next decree targeted walking itself. Theodoric ordered that all subjects, when moving through public spaces, must keep their chins slightly raised and take long, firm strides. Dragging one's feet, or Gazing at the ground for more than 3 seconds was strictly forbidden. For peasants used to toiling in the fields, bent-backed, weary and slow, the law was almost impossible to follow. The fear of punishment now forced them into unnatural, stiff postures that left their necks aching and their steps uncertain. Then came the ban on slow, low-pitched instruments. Theodoric declared that wind instruments producing deep or mournful tones, like the psaltery and low flute, were laments of degeneration. Only fast, high-pitched instruments, such as small flutes and drums, were permitted, for they maintained the rhythm of vigilance. In his mind, slow music bred idleness, ignoring its long tradition in religious ceremonies and moments of contemplation. An even stranger order soon followed, the ban on round personal objects. Subjects could carry only items with square or triangular shapes, as the perfection of the circle represented complete idleness, while angles and straight lines embodied the hardness of reason. The result was chaos. Blacksmiths and craftsmen were forced to remake tools, baskets, and even knife handles into awkward shapes. Function gave way to superstition, driving up costs and daily frustration alike. The impact on the village of Aubépine was unmistakable. People now walked stiffly through the muddy lanes, heads tilted upward in forced alertness. The deep, soothing tones of music that once filled the evenings were gone, replaced by a hollow silence more oppressive than sound itself. Children, scolded for crawling or playing on the ground, grew restless and confused, their laughter replaced by whispers. Parents lived in constant fear of fines or imprisonment at the hands of the count's bailiffs. Such was the absolute power of a feudal lord, a truth history cannot deny. His word was law, and law flowed downward like an unbroken chain, reshaping society to fit the contours of one man's madness. Theodoric's delusion was turning the county of Valerian into a theatre of the absurd, where fear was the engine of obedience and reason no longer had a place. The law forbidding anyone from looking down created one of the strangest and most melancholy sights ever seen at Aubépine's weekly market. Peasants, who once naturally glanced at the ground to avoid loose stones, or simply out of habit born of humility and fatigue, were now forced to keep their chins raised and eyes fixed on the horizon or on the back of the person ahead of them. The result was a bizarre mix of pride and sleepwalking, entirely out of place. The damp, uneven ground beneath their wooden clogs demanded visual attention, yet the fear of a fine turned every step into an act of tension and self-surveillance. Gaspard, the village baker, a short man bent by years of labor over a hot oven, suffered constant pain in his neck from the forced posture, a new physical torment added to his already difficult life. Once he used to glance down at his bakery floor, looking for crumbs or lost coins, but now he had to sweep twice as often, since he could no longer risk looking down while walking. The familiar scents of flour and wood smoke had lost their sweetness, tainted by the acrid smell of anxiety. The ban on low-pitched wind instruments caused the slow death of music in public gatherings. The few celebrations that remained, weddings, baptisms, harvest feasts, were now accompanied only by the sharp rattle of drums and the shrill piping of small flutes. The music, once soothing to the soul, had become fast, metallic, and relentless, allowing no space for introspection or calm. What was meant to bring joy now carried the rhythm of panic. An irony lost on the Count was that, in much of medieval Europe, monasteries were centers of musical and literary development. Gregorian chant, slow, deep, and meditative, was considered the purest form of prayer. By banning low, contemplative tones, Theodoric was unknowingly silencing the very spiritual cadence the Church itself regarded as sacred, replacing reverence with nervous haste. The law against stairways taller than 4 steps forced builders to invent awkward solutions: long ramps, uneven platforms, split levels. Construction costs soared, and even simple improvements became labors of absurd symbolism. The act of climbing, once a practical necessity, had turned into a dangerous gesture of social rebellion. Artisans now built sideways rather than upward, their craft bound by fear rather than function. The restriction on round objects transformed the look of everyday life. Renard, the cooper, now produced barrels and buckets with square bases and slightly angled sides. Awkward to hold, inefficient to use, yet compliant with the Count's geometric paranoia. Form, once the servant of function, now bowed to superstition, reshaping the village into a landscape of uncomfortable, unnatural objects that resisted both hand and habit. Life in Aubépine was slowly being remolded by the shadow of a dream, a gradual desensitization where comfort gave way to rigidity and trust to suspicion. The villagers were learning to live under a code where appearance mattered more than truth, and where logic was subservient to the superstition of power. Up in the castle, Master Ambroise sat at his desk, his goose quill scratching elegant Gothic letters across fresh vellum. The faint smell of wax and ink filled the room as he sealed each decree with care. He knew he wasn't recording a code of law, but a record of madness. Yet his duty was to serve, and all he could do was lend these absurd orders the dignity of calligraphy and the solemnity of an official seal, quietly sealing the fate of this small corner of the Middle Ages. Below, in the village, night fell once again. The smell of stew was faint, subdued by unease. The silence felt unnatural, haunting, hollow. Without Renard's stories or the mournful notes of the low flute, there was a void where warmth once lived, a reminder of the absurdity that now ruled their world. The landscape of the county of Valerian began to change, subtly at first, but unmistakably. Under the pressure of Count Theodoric's laws, what had once been an organic, rustic world was becoming rigid, geometric, and visually tense. The most striking transformation appeared at the entrance to the village of Aubépine, where the Count ordered the construction of a wooden observation monument, an unpolished oak pyramid meant to symbolize the spiritual ascension and rejection of sluggishness of his people. The structure, angular and crude, was unlike anything the villagers had ever seen. It stood as both a gateway and a warning, the first and last thing one saw when entering or leaving, its sharp silhouette a constant reminder of the Count's authority and his madness. Another decree forbade the use of cartwheels taller than a grown man's torso, arguing that oversized wheels encouraged reckless speed and irresponsible transport. The carpenters, forced to rebuild smaller wheels, saw their work multiply and their wagons slow to a crawl. The once steady rhythm of wooden wheels was replaced by a higher-pitched grating creak, a sound of inefficiency echoing through the valley like the groan of fatigue itself. A curious fact, traveller. In true medieval history, the wheel was one of the cornerstones of economic survival. Its technological evolution, the use of iron rims, balanced hubs, reinforced spokes, was vital for trade and agriculture. Theodoric's wheel decree, rooted in symbolic fear rather than function, marked not progress, but regression. Instead of moving forward, he drove his people back toward primitive, back-breaking methods. The air of Aubépine grew thicker with the scent of sweat and strain. Even the castle's daily rhythm changed to reflect its lord's growing obsession with vigilance. Theodoric decreed that all servants must wear wooden-soled shoes inside, so their footsteps would always echo on the stone floors. "Silence," he claimed, "breeds deceit." The hallways were soon filled with the sharp clack-clack of wood on stone, a percussive anthem of repression that followed every movement, a reminder that even walking had become an act of surveillance. Master Ambroise, the Chancellor, now worked under constant observation himself. A pale, nervous young scribe named Elias had been assigned to accompany him at all times, noting every idle glance, every sigh, every pause that might suggest lethargy. The boy smelled faintly of ink and parchment, and his presence was as suffocating as the Count's paranoia, turning the castle's administration into a theatre of forced seriousness. Meanwhile, Theodoric's obsession with symmetry extended beyond policy. He ordered every craftsman in the village to display his tools in precise geometric alignment, hammers, chisels, and saws laid in straight, evenly spaced rows. "Disorder," he declared, "is the seed of decay." For blacksmiths, carpenters, and weavers, whose hands relied on instinct and cluttered familiarity, this demand for sterile order broke the rhythm of creation itself. Work slowed, mistakes multiplied, and the air grew heavy with frustration. This artificial order, imposed on a world built upon practical chaos, weighed heavily on the people of Aubepine. Medieval life had always balanced disorder with productivity. The mess of daily labor was a sign of vitality. Now, every gesture, every breath was measured. The peasants carried their bodies stiffly, eyes fixed forward, walking with the exaggerated urgency of actors in a play. The scent of earth and sweat, once honest and grounding, was now tinged with the acrid smell of fear. Aubepine was slowly becoming a display case for the Count's neurosis, a place where form triumphed over function, and the fear of a dream became more tangible than reality itself. The morning sunlight, which once promised the start of honest work, now revealed a stage of tension and surveillance. Even the church bells, once a call to prayer, now sounded like alarms ringing across a land that had forgotten the meaning of peace. The law restricting the size of cartwheels had an immediate ripple effect across the entire county's trade network. Gauthier, the grain merchant, a broad, heavy man who relied on his large, sturdy cart to haul sacks of wheat to the neighboring city, was now forced to make twice as many trips with his smaller, low-wheeled vehicle. Each journey took longer, and the price of grain rose sharply as a result. He could smell the sweat of his horses mingling with his own, thick in the autumn air, a tangible scent of exhaustion and injustice. Progress, it seemed, was being punished in favor of baseless superstition. Meanwhile, the Oakwood Pyramid at the entrance of the village, the so-called marker of vigilance, had begun to take on an ominous reputation. The peasants whispered that it was a monument meant to watch for slowness, and touching it could draw the attention of the Count's bailiffs. Children, naturally drawn to its angular shape, were quickly pulled away by anxious parents. The rough, splintered texture of the unpolished wood became a symbol of the rigidity imposed upon their lives, a tangible warning to keep one's head down, figuratively, if not literally. Historically speaking, traveller, such shapes held real meaning in medieval minds. Sacred geometry, a philosophy inherited from the ancients, linked triangles and squares to divine order and stability. The circle, though equally sacred, could, in the hands of a fearful or obsessive mind, come to represent stagnation, an endless loop, motion without progress. To Theodoric, this was the perfect metaphor for decay. His fear of regression had taken geometric form. The wooden clogs imposed on the castle servants soon created a new, jarring soundtrack to daily life. The rhythmic clack, clack of soles against stone echoed through the corridors, replacing the soft hum of quiet work. The Count, however, found comfort in the noise. He claimed it allowed him to know where each servant was at any given moment. It was, in essence, an auditory surveillance system, a music of control. But for those wearing them, the cold hardness of wood beneath tired feet was a constant reminder of submission, a burden that scraped both body and spirit. The young scribe Elias had developed a nervous habit of clearing his throat before writing anything, terrified that a moment of silence might be mistaken for administrative idleness. He documented everything: the flicker of Master Ambroise's eyes, The pause between words, even the way a servant placed a jug too slowly on the table. His ink-stained fingers smelled perpetually of iron and fear. The simple act of writing had turned into an instrument of surveillance. Bureaucracy had become espionage. In his forge, the blacksmith Olivier wrestled with the Count's geometric decrees. For a lifetime, he had shaped metal into curved, functional forms, tools molded to the hand, sturdy and efficient. Now he was forced to forge angular handles and triangular grips, their edges biting into the flesh of the user. The hiss of hot iron in water, once the sound of purpose, had taken on a tone of futility. The smell of scorched metal and coal, once a perfume of honest work, now reeked of frustration, a tactile memory of being ruled by madness. Under the pale autumn light, Aubepin had become a place where fear dictated geometry and silence. Life itself had turned into a series of awkward, supervised movements. The Count's neurosis had ceased to be an idea. It had become a physical, audible presence, shaping how people moved, worked, and breathed. And so, traveller, the village stood as a quiet testament to one of history's cruelest truths. Absolute power, even when born of a dream, is the most transformative and destructive force a society can know. The Count's gaze had become the most feared form of surveillance in both castle and village, an invisible pressure always felt that seemed to materialize through each new decree. He no longer sought to control posture alone. He became obsessed with transparency of gesture, convinced that laziness and deceit hid within even the smallest, most unconscious movements. From this paranoia emerged the law of the gentle touch, forbidding any subject from touching their own face or another's with the palm of the hand. Only the outer fingers could be used, and only briefly. To Theodoric, covering one's face was a sign of shame or deception, a gesture of secrecy and spiritual decay. The effects were immediate and unsettling. Mothers could no longer stroke their children's foreheads with a full, warm hand. Men were fined for covering their mouths when yawning, an almost impossible habit to suppress after long hours of labor. Even wiping sweat from the brow had to be done awkwardly, with the back of the hand or a sleeve. The simplest touch, once a language of care, became a source of anxiety. The smell of sweat, once merely the scent of work, now carried the acrid note of fear, the scent of transgression waiting to be punished. Theodoric's mania extended to objects of sentiment and memory. He decreed that all personal tokens, polished stones, carved charms, or small wooden amulets not sanctioned by the church, were to be confiscated and burned in the village square. Such items, he claimed, invited the soul to linger and slowed the vigilance of faith. The thin smoke of burning trinkets, fragrant wood, leather, and feathers hung over Aubepin like incense for a lost world. It was the bittersweet smell of erased memories. To combat what he called the levity of thought, Theodoric issued yet another decree. No inhabitant of Valerian could own more than 3 garments of the same color. Variety, he declared, sharpened the mind. Uniformity dulled it. In an age when most peasants wore coarse wool in earthy shades of brown, grey or black, this law was ruinous. Dyes were expensive, and even muted pigments came at the cost of a week's labor. Historically, sumptuary laws in medieval Europe aimed to limit excess among nobles and the rising merchant class, controlling visible displays of wealth. Theodoric's version was a grotesque inversion. He forced the poorest to mimic luxury for symbolic, neurotic reasons. Poverty itself became grounds for guilt. The impact was vividly seen in Lisbeth, the blacksmith Olivier's wife. For years, she had patched the same 3 woolen tunics, brown and grey, for her husband and sons. Now, under threat of punishment, she dug out her precious scraps of dyed cloth, sewing large, clumsy patches of pale blue, mustard yellow, and moss green into the garments. The family's clothes became mismatched quilts of forced obedience, rough against the skin and humiliating to wear. The most intimate act, the human touch, was now subject to scrutiny. Every gesture was measured, every motion monitored. The peasants of Aubépine learned to fear their own hands, to second-guess every instinct of affection. Serenity gave way to self-surveillance. The county of Valerian had become a laboratory of control, where law replaced love, and the only thing growing faster than fear was blind obedience. Count Theodoric's paranoia had reached a near microscopic level, turning to one of humanity's oldest, most innocent habits, the act of drinking. He had noticed that when people drank from large wooden or metal cups, they tended to tilt their heads far back, an image that, in his fevered mind, made them look like thirsty birds or wild beasts lapping at water. The damp scent of liquid absorbed into the wood only reinforced that primal image, igniting his fear of regression into animality. Thus came one of the most absurd decrees in the Valerian Code. All liquids, water, ale, or wine, had to be consumed through thin reeds or bamboo straws, carefully cut and inspected. The head was to remain perfectly upright while drinking, or the offender risked a fine or the confiscation of their vessel. What had once been a simple, natural motion became an act of concentration and discomfort, particularly cruel for children and the elderly. The rough texture of the reed against the lips, the awkward effort of sucking, turned refreshment into a trial. The law mandating color variation in clothing forced Olivier and Lisbeth into new extremes. They unraveled their last scraps of dyed wool, yellow from weld and blue from woad, once reserved for festive stockings, and stitched them into their grey garments in sharp triangles and squares. The result was a patchwork of mismatched geometry, a mosaic of submission. The uneven weave of each color rubbed against their skin, a daily reminder that comfort had been sacrificed to compliance. A smaller tale spread among the villagers, that of Aymar, the shepherd. Having lost his only brown leather belt, a keepsake from his father, he feared punishment for owning too few colors. In desperation, he braided a thick hemp rope and rubbed it with ash and soot from his hearth to mimic the hue of leather. The rope's coarse fibers chafed his waist raw, and its smell, an acrid mix of smoke and hemp, clung to him all day, marking him as yet another victim of the Count's madness. The ban on covering one's face or yawning openly pushed the peasants to physical and mental exhaustion. Without rest or relief, they learned to hide fatigue behind forced alertness. Sleepiness became sin, weariness a crime. Theodoric had created a world where the natural rhythms of the body were outlawed, and survival depended on pretending to be tireless. It was a collective lie that slowly eroded the spirit. Historically, medieval etiquette, especially in noble courts, was indeed strict, but it served a purpose: to distinguish refinement from rusticity. Theodoric's code, by contrast, was a grotesque parody of that ideal. It imposed courtly precision upon peasant life, not to elevate, but to surveil, to replace grace with fear. From his desk, Master Ambroise watched the latest shipment of drinking reeds arrive at the castle. The faint scent of fresh green straw clashed with the heavy odor of mold and stone that filled the halls. In those harmless reeds, he saw the proof that paranoia had triumphed over reason, that life in Valerian was being stripped, one sense at a time, of its dignity. The serenity of Aubépine was gone. Night's silence no longer meant peace but fear, fear that the smallest motion or faintest sound might violate the Valerian code. The county had become a laboratory of control, where even the most private of human habits was now regulated by law. Count Theodoric's fear had begun reshaping not only daily life, but the very architecture of Valerian society, linking the individual to the collective through an oppressive new order. Convinced that the crawling of his grandchildren in the dream had a communal origin, he reasoned that disorder arose when people mixed freely, without visible distinctions of role or rank. To restore hierarchy, he introduced the law of vertical distinction, requiring every home in Obipan to bear a clear, unique symbol of its occupant's trade, painted in lead grey, a colour the Count described as the hue of humility and the seriousness of labour. The decree drained what little colour remained from village life. Peasants, already poor, were forced to buy mineral pigments to paint crude, awkward emblems. Renard the cooper drew a misshapen barrel on his door. Bertrand the miller painted a grinding wheel. And Gaspard the baker, following an earlier decree on angular shapes, depicted a square loaf of bread. Overnight, the village took on a sombre uniform look. The heavy smell of lime wash and mineral paint filled the air, and the cold touch of wet pigment over rough, aged wood became a physical reminder of authority imposed on every surface. Theodoric's obsession soon extended to possessions. He outlawed the keeping of any item that hadn't been used within 7 days, claiming that stored or idle objects encouraged the sloth of attachment and lazy contemplation. Peasants were forced to discard tools, patched clothes, and family heirlooms, objects often kept out of necessity or sentiment. It was an attack on the very heart of subsistence culture, where survival depended on reusing and preserving whatever one owned. The act of throwing a handmade tool into the flames was like surrendering a piece of one's past. In medieval times, the Church had indeed warned against material excess, preaching voluntary poverty as a path to virtue. But Theodoric's decree was not born of piety. It was pure utilitarian control. He sought to eliminate rest, storage, or reflection, forcing all possessions into constant circulation. Life itself became a treadmill of use and disposal. Every week, a communal bonfire was held in the village square. There, under the eyes of the Count's bailiffs, villagers lined up to burn their useless objects. The air filled with the bittersweet smell of smouldering wood, cloth, and old metal, a ritual of enforced detachment, silent and mournful. The firelight flickered across faces stripped of expression as people watched fragments of their history turn to ash. His fixation with geometry also deepened. Expanding his earlier laws on movement, Theodoric banned the construction of any fence or barrier that wasn't composed of perfectly straight lines and right angles. Rounded stone walls and woven branch enclosures, once cheap and practical, were forbidden. Farmers had to rebuild their boundaries from rigid planks and squared stones, wasting precious daylight in measurement and alignment. The once organic curves of the countryside were replaced by an uncanny grid, a geometry of fear imposed upon the earth itself. And so, traveller, the fear born in a single dream now governed an entire realm. The county of Valerian had become a society of symbols and angles, a place where even the colour of a wall, the shape of a fence, or the weight of an unused hammer bore the mark of law. Individuality dissolved into uniformity. The natural, softened lines of human life were replaced by the cold geometry of a ruler's madness. The rule demanding the disposal of any object unused for 7 days had a cruel and unforeseen impact on the elderly, those for whom such objects often represented the last fragile connection to their past. For old Agnes, a retired weaver, it meant burning her broken handloom, useless for years, yet sacred as the tactile memory of a lifetime of work, the instrument that had once sustained her family. The smell of aged wood and dry linen crackling in the communal fire was, to her, the scent of her own memories, being devoured by the fear of a man who had never even known her name. Despite its intended solemnity, the lead-grey symbols painted on villagers' doors became an unspoken source of sad amusement. The cheap pigment ran easily under the rain, turning careful emblems into dripping, abstract stains. Each storm forced another repainting, another day stolen from labour. The cold, slippery touch of the wet paint on calloused hands served as a daily reminder of obedience's futility. The new rule on straight-angled fences soon bred resentment among neighbors. Bertrand the miller and his closest farmer quarreled endlessly over measurements, for their land was uneven and stubbornly curved. Armed with crude rulers and plumb lines, they spent days realigning their borders, as though geometry could tame the earth. The rhythmic thud of axes cutting and recutting branches echoed across the fields, not as the sound of construction, but as the beat of imposed order. There is, traveller, an old medieval belief, particularly among certain monastic sects, that moral purity could be reflected in physical form, that a straight line symbolized spiritual rectitude. Theodoric, in his delusion, embraced this notion wholeheartedly. To him, forcing fences into perfect right angles was not mere vanity. It was a ritual of purification, an exorcism against moral decay. In practice, it only broke backs and wasted daylight. As the Valerian code expanded, the very perception of space changed. The village ceased to feel alive. It became a diagram of obligation. Each wall, color, and object demanded justification, a reason for existing, a purpose to prove. The sense of hay, soil, and baking bread, once the heartbeat of rural life, was slowly drowned by the acrid odor of cheap paint and the smoke of burnt possessions. In his cold scriptorium, Master Ambroise dipped his quill once more, recording the latest finds: possession of an idle tool, touching one's face improperly, failing to display the mandated grey. The weight of the parchment and the chill of the stone beneath his elbows told him what the Count's madness truly was: an endless drain of human energy, a war not on sin or idleness, but on peace itself. Life in Valerian was no longer its own. It had fused entirely with the neurosis of its lord, a chain linking every gesture, every color, every object to the fevered mind of one man. What had once been quiet endurance was now anxious obedience. The county had become a field of experiments, its people unwilling subjects in the madness of a king. Despite the whirlwind of decrees and the suffocating vigilance that hung over Valerian, nature, with its slow, immutable rhythm, imposed a brief yet profound pause, the first snowfall of the season. In the Middle Ages, such a moment often brought daily life to a standstill, forcing even the most rigid hierarchies to yield to stillness. The silence that descended over the castle of Valerian and the village of Aubépine was unlike the tense quiet of repression. It was the gentle, insulating hush of falling snow. The world seemed to exhale. The creak of wagon wheels, the clang of hammers, even the wooden clack-clack of the servants' shoes, all were absorbed into the muffled breath of winter, creating a fleeting atmosphere of unreality. Count Theodoric, irritated by any interruption to his relentless system of laws, immediately ordered the snow to be cleared so that the rhythm of movement might resume. But the storm only thickened. He could feel the damp chill seeping through the heavy wool curtains of his study, and the soft tap of ice crystals against the glass became a physical reminder of a truth he could not bear: that nature, vast and indifferent, answered to no decree. For the villagers, this forced pause became an unexpected moment of reflection. Renard the cooper, alone in his workshop now stilled by snow, watched as it gathered along the sharp, straight lines of the fences he had been forced to build. To his quiet astonishment, the snow softened those rigid forms, rounding their edges, blurring their angles, as if nature itself were gently correcting the absurd geometry imposed by man. The sight was almost poetic, the pure white smoothness of snow draped over the black hard austerity of law. Even the children, forbidden to crawl or play with round objects, found a way to reclaim their innocence. They began shaping the fresh snow into perfect squares, obedient to the Count's edicts, yet turning that obedience into play. The cold, velvety feel of the snow beneath their small hands became a secret joy, a silent rebellion made of laughter and frost. It echoed a deeper truth of medieval life, the pause of the holy days. Even in times of ceaseless labor, the Church demanded rest, days of quiet worship and reflection. The snow, in its serene indifference, recreated that sacred pause. It was as though the heavens themselves had intervened, freezing the machinery of madness and restoring a moment of stillness that no law could outlaw. Inside the castle, Master Ambroise took advantage of the calm to inspect his scrolls and inkpots, smelling the damp that threatened the precious vellum. As he worked, he reflected on the futility of the laws surrounding him. The ban on purple was meaningless now. Everything lay buried under white. The command to wash the animals' paws was impossible. Water froze in its buckets, and the dogs whimpered as ice clung to their fur. The great Valerian code had been suspended by something infinitely larger than fear, indifference itself. He paused, quill in hand, and watched the slow descent of snowflakes drifting through the pale light of the scriptorium window. For the first time in many months, the sound within the castle was not one of authority or anxiety, but of peace. The snowfall was a contemplative stillness imposed not by the will of a ruler, but by the hand of nature itself. A quiet reminder that no matter how many laws a man might write, the rhythm of life ultimately belongs to forces far beyond his command. The decree of the reed straws, prohibiting the tilting of one's head while drinking, became laughably impossible to follow once the snow arrived. The bitter cold made the reeds stiff and brittle, and drawing water through them with the head held perfectly upright was exhausting. For Gaspar, the baker, already parched from hours before his oven, even a sip required painful concentration. The cold, rough touch of the reed against his lips stung like frostbite, turning thirst into torment. He soon realized the irony. The cold water forced him to drink more slowly than ever, embodying precisely the slowness the Count so despised. A basic act of survival had become an act of surveillance. As he watched droplets escape through the cracked reed, the damp smell of wet straw and cold water filled him with quiet despair, the scent of futility itself. In Mabile's tavern, nearly empty because of the storm, the silence was so deep she could hear the fire crackle and the faint rustle of her own breath. She glanced at the table where men once played tabula, and the absence of the clattering game pieces was like a missing heartbeat. For a moment, she reflected on the strange culture of haste the Count had forced upon them, a system meant to enforce motion, yet which had produced only stillness and isolation. Lisbeth the weaver spent the snowbound days making thicker socks and shawls. Forbidden from using purple and forced to mix colors, she wove together the few remaining threads she had, blue, yellow, and dull green, into awkward combinations. Yet in the hush of her home, she found that the feel of those uneven threads sliding through her fingers offered something unexpected, a tactile mirror of the Count's chaos, yet also a fragile form of calm. Unknowingly, Lisbeth was touching something ancient. In the Middle Ages, weaving had been not just work, but meditation, a rhythmic art that connected hand, breath, and thought. Theodoric's laws sought to eliminate such rhythm, yet the snow restored it. As her shuttle moved back and forth, the slow cadence of her loom became a quiet act of defiance, its steady beat a balm against the tyranny of speed. At the castle, the silence was broken only by the distant echo of Theodoric's futile commands to clear what cannot be cleared. Master Ambroise, listening, realized something profound. The Count's laws only held power in motion and visibility. Once the realm stood still, once the world turned white, his decrees lost meaning. The snow, indifferent and absolute, had become the kingdom's most peaceful rebellion. Looking out across the frozen landscape, Ambrose saw that the snow's blank uniformity had erased the visual madness of Valerian, the angular fences, the grey symbols, the clashing colours. The earth itself had chosen not to obey. The storm, with its cold and isolating touch, had given Valerian its first true moment of grace, a truce not written in law, but in silence. With the end of the snowfall, Count Theodoric's fear found a new form, one that turned inward toward identity and memory. He had become convinced that degeneration began with the loss of self, with forgetting one's own history. After reading an obscure treatise on the sanctity of names and ancestry, he concluded that the common simplicity of his subjects' names invited mediocrity and confusion, which in turn could lead to anonymity, and, in his fevered imagination, to bestial decay. From this obsession emerged a new decree, the Edict of Nominal Distinction. Every adult in the county of Valerian was now required to adopt a second name, a cognomen, reflecting a physical trait, a personal defect, or some notable accident that had befallen them. The Count claimed it would preserve individuality and prevent social confusion. In truth, it branded each person with a permanent mark of shame. Olivier the blacksmith, who had lost a piece of his little finger years before in a forge accident, was ordered to rename himself Olivier Stump. What had once been a private misfortune was now a public humiliation. The scent of scorched iron on his hands, once the perfume of his craft, now carried the memory of mutilation. The absence of that fingertip, a detail he had long accepted, became, through the echo of his new name, a fresh wound reopened with every greeting. For Margot, the youngest servant in the castle, the decree was crueler still. 17 years old, clumsy and shy, she was known for tripping over her own feet in moments of haste. The Count's officials assigned her the name Margot Fall, a label that turned her nervous stumbles into a source of mockery. The sound of her name, once soft and unremarkable, now rang through the corridors as a cruel joke, its syllables heavy with derision. Ironically, Theodoric's mania for distinction echoed a real medieval transition. In the high Middle Ages, surnames were rare among peasants. People were known by their father's name, their trade, or their birthplace. The Count was, in his madness, accelerating the invention of surnames, but not through heritage or pride. Instead, he forged a taxonomy of humiliation, turning the act of naming into an instrument of control. His paranoia deepened. To prevent what he called social duplication, Theodoric outlawed gatherings of people who shared the same first name for more than 5 minutes, unless it was for essential trade. Thus, the many Jeans and Maries of Aubepin began to avoid one another, fearful of suspicion and fines. What had been casual friendship and familiarity became silence and avoidance. Among them were 2 cousins, June Bent and Jean Crooked, names newly assigned to mock their postures. They once walked to the field side by side, sharing the weight of tools and the comfort of wordless kinship. Now, they exchanged only brief nods from afar, afraid that their shared name might be seen as a conspiracy of sameness. The warmth of companionship had been replaced by the stiffness of forced distance. In targeting names, Theodoric had found a deeper way to wound his people. The Edict of Nominal Distinction was not just another absurd rule, it was an assault on identity itself. The village was no longer a community, but a collection of stigmatized individuals, each carrying their own label of disgrace. The Count's paranoia had evolved, from the policing of gestures and colors to the policing of the soul. The enforcement of the Edict of Nominal Distinction gave rise to scenes of deep and painful embarrassment across Valerian. Bertrand the miller, whose only notable trait was his thick, fiery red beard, was ordered to present himself as Bertrand the Red. What should have been a harmless descriptor became a mockery. In a community where beards were common, his new name singled him out for something trivial and visible, turning familiarity into ridicule. The smell of flour that once clung to him with pride was now mixed with the sour scent of humiliation, and each coarse brush of his beard against his chin was a tactile reminder of his new, involuntary identity. Gaspard the baker, who years ago had broken his left arm falling from a roof, was renamed Gaspard the lame, though the arm had long healed and served him perfectly well. Hearing his name shouted in the marketplace forced him to relive the pain and helplessness of that distant day. What had once been a story of recovery had become a permanent scar made of words. Each time his name was spoken, it reopened a wound that should have stayed closed. The ban on gatherings of people who shared the same name turned daily social life into a web of careful avoidance. The two Thomases of the village, one a blacksmith's apprentice, the other a goatherd, were neighbors who often helped each other with chores. Now they had to communicate through coded gestures from across the street, keeping at least 20 paces apart, as if friendship itself were a crime. The subtle warmth of neighborly solidarity had been replaced by the stiffness of fear. Family ties, too, began to fray. In the Middle Ages, it was a mark of honor for sons to bear the name of their fathers or grandfathers, a symbol of continuity and lineage. Now parents had to scold their children for speaking too long with others who shared their name. Mothers, calling their sons by their newly assigned, often cruel cognomens, filled the air with a tone of sorrow. What had once been affection was now a command of discipline, the sound of family bonds quietly breaking. In yet another twist of his mania, Count Theodoric decreed that no food, except bread, could be eaten with the hands in public. To touch food directly, he claimed, was to descend into animal confusion and digestive chaos. The peasants, bewildered, were forced to carve crude wooden utensils and to eat with rigid formality. A simple act, eating, became a slow, awkward ritual that contradicted the Count's own obsession with speed. Meals turned into silent ceremonies of discomfort, where even hunger bowed to absurdity. Master Ambroise, the Chancellor, felt his quill tremble as he recorded the edict. The sharp, metallic scent of oak gall ink filled the air as he realized that the Count's madness had moved beyond control. It had reached the destruction of dignity itself. Every stroke of the pen was the documentation of cruelty made law. The county of Valerian now stood on the brink of a quiet revolt, not against hunger or taxation, but against humiliation. The Valerian Code had become a social straitjacket, binding thought, gesture, and identity. Only the brute force of the Count's guards and the iron weight of feudal obedience kept the realm from breaking apart entirely. And beneath the silence, in the minds of peasants and nobles alike, something had begun to stir. A slow, quiet hatred, colder and more enduring than the winter itself. Count Theodoric's paranoia soon found a new realm to conquer, one rooted in the senses. Convinced that the degeneration he had dreamed of stemmed from the blurring of everyday smells and sounds, he declared that moral order could only be achieved through sensory purity. Thus was born the Edict of Clear Aromas and Echoes, a collection of laws that struck directly at the natural rhythms of life in the county of Valerian. The first and most absurd of these decrees forbade the cooking of any food over open flames in public spaces. Theodoric claimed that the mingling of smoke and scent was promiscuous, that it polluted the air with the laziness of digestion. From that moment, all cooking had to take place in closed ovens or indoor hearths with proper chimneys. In a time when open fires were essential for every household, this mandate turned a communal necessity into a hardship. The familiar aroma of wood smoke, once a comforting symbol of warmth and company, became the scent of repression. To enforce auditory clarity, Theodoric banned the overlap of artistic and labouring sounds. No singing, no playing of instruments was permitted whenever hammers struck or mill wheels turned. He called the coexistence of song and work a distraction from productive order. The effect was devastating. Work songs and rhythmic chants, which had once lifted spirits and synchronized movements, fell silent. The moments between hammer blows became hollow, filled only with a strained, joyless quiet. Ironically, across much of medieval Europe, music and rhythm had been vital to labor. Harvesters sang to pace their scythes, builders chanted to lift stone. In Valerian, that harmony was dismantled. Theodoric's mania for separation replaced usefulness with anxiety, stripping work of its rhythm and its humanity. His control soon reached the animal world. He decreed that every dog in Valerian must be fed exclusively on unfermented rye bread, insisting that the yeast fumes of laziness dulled their instincts. The law forced peasants to sacrifice precious loaves to feed their animals, and the smell of fermenting dough, once the perfume of abundance, became a forbidden scent. Lisbeth the weaver felt this new oppression most keenly in her kitchen. She learned to cook with milder herbs, terrified that the aroma of garlic or onion drifting from her chimney might be denounced as olfactory promiscuity. The bland taste and soft texture of her meals became physical reminders of how fear now ruled even the senses. The edict of clear aromas and echoes turned daily life into an exercise in sensory restraint. Smell, sound, and touch, once the essence of being alive, were now subject to suspicion and law. Valerian had become a place scrubbed of texture and warmth, an airless realm where even the faintest fragrance or note could be seen as rebellion. The only thing that could still be clearly perceived in Theodoric's kingdom was the weight of his madness, pressing down like a silence that no one dared to break. The ban on open-fire cooking in public spaces struck at the very heart of Aubepine's communal life. Once, the mingling aromas of stews and roasts had filled the air, drawing neighbors together around shared flames where stories, recipes, and laughter passed as freely as the smoke. Now each family was forced to cook behind closed doors, in poorly ventilated hearths, sealing themselves off from one another. The heavy, acrid smoke that clung to the interiors of homes smelled not of warmth, but of confinement and mistrust, a stale echo of what had once been the fresh, open scent of community. For Gaspar the baker, known now as Gaspar the Lame, the loss was tangible. His livelihood depended on the scent of bread baking, the invisible promise that drifted through the village and guided hungry feet to his door. But the new law demanded closed ovens, and the smell of yeast and toasted flour no longer reached the streets. The silence of that missing aroma was louder than any bell. It was the silence of hunger, of a trade turned mute. Though he still felt the comforting heat of fresh bread in his hands, the joy of scent, so essential to medieval commerce, had been stolen by decree. The edict separating music from labor silenced the spinning songs of the women, whose rhythmic voices once guided the motion of the loom and softened the monotony of endless weaving. Lisbeth, working now in forced quiet, found her hands faltering, her pace uneven. Without song, the threads tangled more often and mistakes multiplied. The irony was cruel. In trying to abolish slowness, the Count had made work slower than ever. A curious detail of medieval life was that many artisans deliberately shaped their environments through smell, using different ashes or coals to create distinctive scents for their trades, or even for personal hygiene, such as washing with wood ash soap. Theodoric's mania for purity destroyed these subtle customs, replacing familiar comforts with costly substitutes few could afford. The Edict of Aromas extended further still, forbidding the keeping of flowers or herbs indoors if their scent was excessively sweet or narcotic. Such fragrances, the Count claimed, dulled the mind and invited moral decay. What had once been a simple joy, a sprig of lavender, a few petals in a bowl, became contraband. The soft touch of petals, the delicate perfume of nature brought indoors, were now punishable indulgences. In his growing obsession with control, Theodoric ordered the installation of metal wind chimes across the castle towers, crafted in harsh, angular shapes to comply with his geometric laws. They were meant to symbolize constant vigilance, ringing whenever the wind stirred, a proof that the realm was always in motion. In truth, they produced only a ceaseless, piercing noise, a metallic screech that grated against the ears of all who lived within range. Day and night, the sound haunted the air, turning the sky itself into a tool of surveillance. Master Ambroise, hunched over his parchment, wrote now to the constant accompaniment of those chimes, their sharp clangs echoing through the halls like the pulse of madness itself. The metallic scent of his gall ink mingled with the thin air of the scriptorium, and he understood, with growing dread, that the Count's reign had reached its final transformation. Theodoric had traded the rich, living tapestry of the senses for the sterile order of his own neurosis. What remained in Valerian was not the harmony of a kingdom, but the muffled quiet of fear, the only sensation still shared by all. Snowmelt trickled from the eaves in thin, steady lines, and with it the village's brief hush began to lift. Yet the quiet that returned was not the gentle kind. It was a measured stillness, the sort that watches doorways and keeps count of footsteps, as if the walls themselves feared being overheard. At dawn, the castle wind chimes resumed their thin metallic clatter, pecking at the air like impatient birds. Their angles flashed dull silver against the pale sky, and every gust rewound the noise. Aubépine breathed in time with those chimes, flinching softly each time the wind turned. Gaspard, the lame, rose before the light and tested a fresh batch of dough with careful fingers. The loaf felt right, springy, alive, yet the scent that should have drifted into the lane stayed penned inside the oven's throat. He cupped the bread as one might cradle a sleeping child, and understood without words that warmth without aroma was only half a blessing. Lisbeth set her shuttle moving and tried instinctively to hum the beat that had guided her hands since girlhood. The first note died in her throat, swallowed by the memory of fines and sharp ears, so she let the loom speak alone, soft wooden taps, thread sighing between fingers, an almost music that wouldn't betray her. Renard the cooper paced his workshop and listened to the empty square beyond. Once, voices would have braided together there, laughter, bargaining, a child's quick song. Now the air held single strands of sound that never touched, as if the village had been combed of knots and left too smooth to hold. Dogs nosed their bowls of heavy rye, chewing dutifully without joy. Their eyes followed their owners with a puzzled patience, as though waiting for the old scraps and scents that used to mark each hour. In the evenings they slept early, not from fullness, but from resignation. The baker's wife pinned a sprigless ribbon beside the hearth and sighed at the blankness of it. A wash of scent, a bruised leaf, a thinning of sweetness would once have tricked the room into feeling warmer. Now the fire's light flickered over clean, scentless stone, bright and empty as a polished plate. On market days that no longer smelled like markets, the miller's cart rattled past with smaller wheels and larger worry. Buyers examined grain by weight and sight alone. Their noses denied the story of freshness. They spoke less, purchased faster, and went home to cook in private. As the sky cleared, the village noticed how quickly smoke gave away a careless chimney. Everyone learned the new habit, a glance up before adding fuel, a hand on the damper, a pause to test the draw. The old, easy conversation of fire and air had been turned into a negotiation. Children, kept from songs and kept from round toys, invented a quiet game of shadows on the wall. Palms turned to edges, fingers to little roofs and corners. They built squares of light and dark that crept along the plaster. They giggled without sound and chased their own geometry. Margot Fall carried water with that small, brave concentration of a person afraid of being seen to stumble. The bucket's handle pressed a red mark into her palm. She wore it like a secret medal all morning. When someone called her new name from afar, she didn't turn. She let the wind swallow it. Olivier Stump hammered a knife tang into a triangular grip and waited for his hand to approve of the lie. It didn't. Function resisted flattery. The edge shone, but the hold betrayed it, and he set the tool aside with a quiet apology to the purpose of things. Master Ambroise stood on the gallery and let the wind bells count the seconds. He had begun to measure time by their petty insistence, the way a prisoner will come to know the guard's footsteps. When they were still, his head rang with their absence, as if silence now needed translation. In the square, the weekly bonfire for idle objects burned with a disciplined flame that made no one warmer. The crowd watched without murmuring, while old handles, threadbare shirts, and shy keepsakes yielded to smoke. It was a ceremony without a saint. Supper became a slow rite of utensils and careful posture. Bowls were lifted like reliquaries, and spoons moved in narrow, sanctioned arcs. People ate as if they were being watched by a painting on the wall. When Lisbeth finished a shawl, she folded it with both pride and apology, as though a beautiful thing were safer disguised in plainness. Her fingers lingered at the seams where the colours met uneasily. She thought of how water makes quarrelsome dyes agree for a while. Renard walked the fence he had squared against the world and inspected where snow had softened the tyrant corners. Melt traced a gentle argument along each right angle, teaching the post to forgive its own stubbornness. Renard nodded, as if to a tutor who asked nothing in return. The baker pulled a single loaf from the oven and broke it just to hear the sound. The brittle crack was honest, at least. He imagined the lost chorus of yeast and crust and heat, a language the village used to speak fluently, and he tucked the thought away like a crumb. In the fields, earth thawed in uneven patches, rejecting the idea that straight lines could persuade it to wake all at once. The spade found soft and hard by turns, a rhythm older than law. Men worked with it, not against it, and finished sooner than their plans allowed. The wind shifted, and the castle chimes stuttered into a different quarrel. For a heartbeat, their clamour aligned into something like a measure, and then unravelled again. Ambroise half smiled. Even obedience couldn't keep time with itself. At dusk, Mabille wiped a clean table and set down 2 cups no one would lift. The fire made a low, faithful music that broke no rule but comforted anyway. She leaned near the hearth and let her cheek learn its warmth without touching with the palm of her hand. Dogs padded the lanes, noses low, searching for the outlawed stories of baking and broth. Finding little, they settled instead for the tracks of feet and carts. Blunter tales, but still true. Their tails beat the ground softly, punctuation marks in dust. Agnes, the retired weaver, sat by her window and counted the threads of the day backward. She named its hours by what they had failed to smell. No rosemary, no onion, no smoke that shared. When she reached morning again, she began once more, gently correcting nothing. That night, the sky went clean and cold, and sound carried like thin glass. A cart on distant stones sounded close. A whispered joke seemed almost brave. In the clarity, people remembered how the world could be simple without being barren. Near midnight, a courier climbed the keep stairs with a sealed tablet bumping at his hip. The bells fidgeted in the wind as he passed under them, and the sentry stepped aside without a word. In the lamplight of the council chamber, Ambroise saw the new wax, unbroken, official, the next turn of the screw, and laid out a fresh sheet of vellum to receive what the Count would soon call an edict. Beneath the pale afternoon a strange calm had settled over Aubépine, like a pause that pretended to be peace. The villagers moved more slowly now, not because of fatigue, but because the air itself seemed to weigh their limbs down, thickened by fear and unshed words. Lisbeth passed by the old well where laughter once gathered, her hands wrapped around a silent spool of thread. She could almost hear the echo of old songs clinging to the stones. The air smelled faintly of iron and damp wood. What remained after scent itself had been legislated away. Inside the mill, Bertrand Redbeard pushed the wheel in dull rhythm, the sound no longer accompanied by his usual humming. The silence between each creak of the millstone felt unnatural, as if the building had been robbed of its heartbeat. Renard the cooper tried to mend a barrel, but found his hands trembling. He wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from the quiet that made every movement sound like defiance. Each hammer strike felt too loud, too personal, like an admission of unrest. Even the birds seemed uneasy. The crows that used to gather on the rooftops had flown toward the woods, repelled perhaps by the metallic clamor of the Count's chimes that no wind could silence. In the evenings, smoke rose timidly from chimneys, thin and uncertain. Families huddled by their hearths, speaking in murmurs that died before reaching the ceiling. Children were taught to breathe quietly, as though noise could summon punishment. At the edge of the village, Margot Fall watched frost settle on the fence posts. She noticed how nature drew its own patterns, curved and free, mocking the forced geometry of the Count's designs. She smiled faintly, a private rebellion no one could arrest. Agnès, old and wrapped in her grey shawl, whispered her prayers to the rhythm of the chimes. Her faith had outlived the laws, though it had grown quieter, gentler, like a candle determined to burn without being seen. Gaspard's bakery smelled faintly of yeast again. He had risked letting a single loaf bake uncovered, the scent slipping into the street for a few seconds before the wind carried it away. That fleeting fragrance brought two neighbors to his door, their eyes wet with gratitude and memory. Lisbeth found herself dreaming of color, violets, scarlets, the forbidden purple that haunted the Count's decrees. She woke with the echo of the hues still in her chest, wondering if dreams, too, would someday be regulated. Master Ambroise spent his nights in the scriptorium, his candlelight flickering against shelves of parchment that smelled of dust and vinegar. He recorded each new law carefully, yet in the margins he began writing in invisible shorthand, a secret chronicle of sorrow and absurdity. When the bells of the castle rang for morning inspection, Ambroise paused to listen. The clangs no longer startled him. They had become the rhythm of tyranny itself, a music composed of obedience and fear. Outside, the dogs gathered by the square, their ribs showing beneath winter coats. They sniffed the ground where the bonfires once burned and whimpered softly, searching for the ghosts of familiar smells. Mobile's tavern stood nearly empty, but she kept the fire alive anyway. Its warmth wasn't for business now. It was an act of defiance. Each ember was a protest against coldness, each spark a whispered prayer for memory. At noon, sunlight glinted off the wind chimes above the castle like shards of a broken mirror. For a moment, Ambroise thought they looked beautiful. Then one chimed sharply, and the beauty shattered. Jean Calvo and Jean Curveau crossed paths by the well but dared not speak. They simply exchanged nods, their silence carrying the weight of a lifetime of friendship reduced to caution. Olivier Stump sharpened his tools in the courtyard. Each stroke of metal against stone reminded him of breath, slow, steady, necessary. He sharpened in rhythm, defying the decree against music with the quiet percussion of survival. The snow had melted, but the fields were slow to forgive. Mud clung to boots and shovels like a stubborn truth, refusing to be flattened into neat lines. The land itself seemed to resist the Count's geometry. At dusk, Ambroise read by lamplight, his eyes moving slowly over the words of ancient philosophers, men who once believed order could coexist with kindness. He smiled sadly. They had never met Theodoric. By nightfall, the wind rose again. The chimes screamed like restless spirits, echoing through corridors and across frozen hills. In their shrill music, Ambroise thought he could almost hear the Count's heartbeat, a rhythm quickened by paranoia. In the great hall, the Count paced beneath banners faded by smoke. His reflection flickered in the tall windows, multiplied by torchlight, until even he seemed uncertain which image was truly his. He paused by the window and gazed toward the village. Tiny specks of firelight dotted the darkness below, homes still daring to glow. "They're too warm," he muttered. "Warmth breeds thought." Ambroise stood in the doorway, the new edict in his hand. "Your Grace," he said softly, "the scribes await your words." Theodoric turned, eyes wide and fevered. "Then let it be known," he whispered, "that warmth itself is a temptation. We shall regulate the fires." Outside, the wind carried the chimes' metallic laughter across the fields, cold, endless, and merciless. The next edict was already forming in the dark. Valerian only served to intensify Count Theodoric's neurosis. He saw every natural change as a sign of disorder. With the arrival of shorter days and the fading sunlight, he became obsessed with the idea that darkness would promote a slowness of spirit, and consequently the degeneration foretold in his dream. To combat this subtle threat, he issued the Edict of Forced Luminosity, a series of decrees meant to keep every space artificially illuminated, even at the expense of his subjects' safety and livelihood. The most impactful law required every household in the village of Aubepine, and even within the castle walls, to keep at least one candle burning in each window facing the street, from sunset to sunrise, regardless of whether the home was occupied or whether the family could afford it. This was an unbearable financial burden for the peasants, since both tallow and beeswax were expensive and precious. Being forced to burn these resources all night long drained what little they had. The visual effect was strange and almost ghostly. Hundreds of flickering flames seemed to float in the dark air, casting a dim but steady light across the streets, a spectacle of enforced waste. The smell of burning tallow, thick and nauseating, hung over the village through the night, replacing the crisp scent of dawn with the stench of despair and constant surveillance. The feel of glass or mica, hot and smudged with soot, served as a physical reminder of the law's cost. The Count also extended his law against movement. Any slow or repetitive gesture, such as rocking a child in one's arms or tapping one's foot impatiently, was strictly forbidden, as it was seen as a rhythm of stagnation and a symptom of idleness. This law struck directly at the few gestures of comfort the peasants still had. The fear of an accidental movement made standing in public an exercise in tension. To reinforce his vision of constant vigilance, Theodoric ordered the blacksmiths, including Olivier Stump, to forge small wooden clappers to be carried by his bailiffs and inspectors, each producing a sharp, dry sound every 10 steps. The constant rhythmic clacking echoed through the village streets and castle corridors, an irritating, penetrating noise that served as both punishment and reminder of the law's presence. Lisbeth, the weaver, worked under the weak glow of her candlelight, stitching her colored scraps together while feeling the heat of the flame on her face and the acrid smell of melting tallow in the air. She whispered Theodoric's reasoning to herself like a prayer, convincing herself that wasting wax was a noble sacrifice to keep the darkness at bay, even though she knew deep down it was nothing but madness disguised as order. The warmth of the flame pressed on her skin like a warning, constant, fragile, and dangerous. Count Theodoric had turned the natural rhythm of day and night into a war against darkness and stillness, using fire and sound as his weapons of control. The county of Valerian now glowed with forced light, and the air itself trembled under the ceaseless hum of vigilance. The edict of forced luminosity quickly became one of the greatest sources of silent resentment in the village of Aubepine, as it struck directly at the peasants' means of survival. The price of tallow and wax soared, and many families were forced to burn small amounts of pork fat or rancid oil instead of beeswax, producing darker smoke and a sharp, unpleasant smell, a constant aroma of poverty and submission. The sting of the smoke in their eyes was painful, but it was preferable to the fine imposed for failing to keep a light burning. The fear of slow or repetitive motion led to mutual surveillance among neighbors. Old Agnes, the weaver, who once had the habit of gently rocking in her chair while meditating or mending clothes, now had to remain perfectly still, feeling the uncomfortable stiffness of her forced posture. She realized that silence, once peaceful, was now heavy with tension, preventing any form of rest or reflection. In contrast to the enforced stillness, the sharp, rapid clatter of the bailiffs' and inspectors' wooden ratchets became the dominant sound of public life. That constant, angular noise echoed through the candle-lit streets like a mechanical heartbeat of oppression, drowning out conversations and replacing them with an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety. The relentless tempo of the ratchet was the antithesis of the organic, rural rhythm, a form of auditory torture imposed upon the people. A historical curiosity that parallels this imposition is the medieval practice of night watchmen, who patrolled the streets with lanterns and clappers to prevent fires and crimes. In Valerian, however, the ratchet was not a sign of protection from an external threat or criminal. It was an instrument of surveillance against internal slowness and quietude, turning a precautionary custom into a tool of neurosis. Master Ambroise, the Chancellor, noticed that the constant illumination was creating a cruel paradox. The lack of sleep and the stress of endless vigilance made both the peasants and the castle servants slower and more inattentive during the day, violating the very purpose of the Count's decree. He saw sleep, a natural need, transformed into a dangerous luxury, and the touch of insomnia was visible in the irritability and fatigue etched on every face. Count Theodoric, however, grew ever more isolated in his conviction, seeing in the lights and ratchets the proof that he was conquering darkness and pushing back degeneration. He reinforced his belief through soft repetition, whispering to himself that light is motion and silence is the grave. His sanity was slowly unraveling, and the realm mirrored his descent, a place where the night shone bright, yet every soul lay in darkness. The serenity of night had been stolen. The county of Valerian was now consumed by the smell of burning tallow and the sound of the ratchet. The slow rhythm of nature had been replaced by the frantic rhythm of law, and the only certainty left was obedience to the absurd. The final phase of Count Theodoric's neurosis centered on preparing for what he believed would be the ultimate confrontation against degeneration. Convinced that the end was near, he demanded that the realm brace itself for a last stand. He began to see the very bodies of his subjects as reservoirs of slowness, believing that physical weakness was the entry point for the evil prophesied in his dream. This obsession culminated in the Edict of Hardness and Bodily Restraint, the most invasive of all his decrees, one that turned pain and discomfort into civic and religious virtues. The cruelest of these laws forbade the use of warm water for bathing or personal hygiene throughout the county of Valerian, requiring that everyone wash their bodies and clothes only in cold water. The Count claimed that heat softened both muscle and spirit, inviting laziness. During the harsh medieval winter, this decree turned hygiene into an act of torture and penance. The shock of freezing water on the skin became a daily punishment, a physical toll extracted by the Count's paranoia. The smell of unwashed bodies and damp garments soon mingled with the heavy odor of burning tallow. To further suppress any hint of lethargy, Theodoric extended his ban on low sounds to human speech. No one was allowed to speak in a low voice or whisper in public, as this was seen as a sign of secrecy, slow communication, or conspiracy. All conversation had to be loud and clear, forcing peasants to shout even in close proximity. The sound of raised voices filled the streets, a cacophony of tension masquerading as order. Gaspar Stump, the baker, who had always spoken softly by nature, was forced to project his voice when announcing his angular loaves, leaving him hoarse and exhausted by day's end. He felt the dryness in his throat, the strain along his vocal cords, a new kind of pain born from the tyranny of sound. He feared that his hoarseness might be interpreted as weakness or slowness of speech, which could earn him yet another fine. A historical parallel to this madness can be found in the medieval practice of mortification of the flesh, physical penance performed by monks and ascetics seeking purification of the soul. Yet Theodoric had taken what was once a voluntary spiritual discipline and imposed it upon every subject as a civic obligation. His decree stripped the act of all sanctity, leaving only coercion and coldness behind. Master Ambroise, the Chancellor, watched in horror as the castle servants' health deteriorated. Their hands were cracked, their lips blue, their bodies trembling from the constant cold. He could smell the damp chill rising from the buckets and basins, a scent of suffering. He knew the only way to end this spiral of madness was through stillness and acceptance, and he quietly encouraged calm resignation among the few who still spoke to him. The Count had forced his realm into a state of perpetual alertness, preparing for an ending that existed only in his mind. Life in Valerian had become a form of public penance, where cold, noise, and pain were the only certainties. The law of mandatory cold bathing, imposed by Count Theodoric, inspired a quiet and ingenious form of passive resistance among some peasants. They discovered that by rubbing their bodies with cider vinegar and wood ash before pouring the icy water, the sting of the cold was slightly dulled, the vinegar's sharp scent mixed with the heavy smoke of burning tallow, creating an aroma of penance and cunning. Though crude, this method was a small act of defiance against the cruelty of the law, a way to soften, however briefly, the tactile pain of the cold. The touch of freezing water on bare skin in the middle of winter was not only uncomfortable, but dangerous, leading to illness and infection, ironically increasing the very weakness and slowness the Count sought to eliminate. Theodoric was so obsessed with the virtue of hardness that he failed to see the practical and human cost of his decree, a common flaw among rulers who value symbols above survival. The scent of sickness and fever began to spread subtly through the air, a faint aroma of frailty that the Count tried to combat with even greater rigidity. To ensure that the law of loud speech was obeyed, the Count ordered the installation of rough wooden panels throughout the castle and village, carved with the phrase, "The slowness of voice is the cowardice of thought," written in vulgar Latin so that everyone could understand. The coarse feel of unpolished wood and the sight of those words served as constant threatening reminders of sonic vigilance, coercing the people to speak in a strained, unnatural tone. One small human story born of this decree involved Margot Tumba, the young servant of the castle. She had fallen in love with Thierry, the pantry guard, and until then they had exchanged tender, whispered words in secret corners of the keep. Now, the law of loud speech made intimacy impossible, forcing them to communicate through glances and gestures. When they were compelled to speak aloud, their voices sounded hollow and dutiful, tones of obligation instead of affection. Lisbeth, the weaver, noticed that the law also affected prayer. Monks and worshippers, long accustomed to murmured devotions and low tones of contemplation, were now required to raise their voices during prayer. What had once been an intimate act of communication with God became a loud, public performance, stripped of calm and comfort. She could feel the rigidity in her prayers, now more a burden than a solace. In his final stage of madness, the Count also forbade slow or prolonged blinking in public, claiming that a slow blink was a sign of drowsiness and lack of vigilance. He demanded that eyelids move quickly and sharply, a command that left peasants' eyes dry and irritated. Theodoric believed that even the body's natural rhythm should bend to his will, turning the human form into an instrument of constant obedience. Master Ambroise, the Chancellor, tried desperately to find some legal precedent to curb the Count's madness. He leafed through old scrolls on Visigothic lore and Carolingian capitularies, the smell of mould and dust rising from the parchment. He knew the end was near, for Theodoric had exhausted all external means of control and was now attacking the very biological and spiritual essence of his people. The kingdom was teetering on collapse, a collapse the Count called the final victory of order. Count Theodoric, in his desperate search for a cure to the nightmare of degeneration, began to recall earlier images from his dream with obsessive clarity, reinterpreting them through the lens of his new rigidity. He ordered the old ban on the color purple to be reinforced with a new decree. No dark or moss-green object or food that could remotely resemble the moss from his dream was to be kept in any household unless meant for immediate consumption. This law forced peasants to discard much of their stores of lentils, dried peas, and certain dark cheeses, vital sources of nutrition during winter, filling the air with the smell of hunger and waste. He also remembered the wild beasts from his nightmare and, in one final act of control, issued a ban on the use of any animal hide for clothing or bedding except sheepskin. He claimed that wearing the furs of wild or exotic animals encouraged a return to savagery and excessive warmth. The decree deprived many villagers of the rabbit and fox pelts that had shielded them from the bitter cold, increasing the tactile discomfort of winter and the risk of frostbite. The smell of raw wool and damp air, now unsoftened by fur, made the nights feel even colder. One last historical parallel to the Count's severity can be found in certain regions of the Middle Ages, where the gallows and public punishment were used to instill fear. Theodoric, however, carried this to a grotesque extreme. He ordered the construction of a wooden angular cage in the village square, where violators of the slow blink or low voice laws were to spend the day fasting, their public humiliation serving as a living instrument of vigilance. The hoarse, pleading sound of their voices became a constant reminder of his authority. Master Ambroise, as he recorded the decrees on furs and forbidden foods, realized that the Count had finally exhausted both the resources and dignity of his realm. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, a physical echo of the cold bath decree, and the coarse touch of his own tunic, now his only defense against the chill of stone. He was ready for the end, for the moment when reality would finally collide with his lord's madness. Lisbeth, the weaver, looked up at the night sky, which should have been peaceful and dark, and saw instead the faint glow of the mandated candles in every window, a spectacle of forced waste. She felt the touch of wool against her skin, the only thing keeping her warm, and whispered to herself a calm expectation of the end, the belief that no madness lasts forever, and that absurdity eventually burns itself out, returning Aubépine to its natural rhythm. The county of Valerian was, quite literally, being prepared for collapse. Through hunger, cold, and sensory exhaustion, a heavy price paid for the neurotic interpretation of a dream. The touch of exhaustion and the scent of hunger had become the dominant sensations in the village of Aubépine. Theodoric, convinced that the realm had finally achieved the hardness necessary to repel the prophecy, had reached the limits of his ability to legislate. The absence of natural light during the long nights, combined with the bitter cold, worsened by the bans on warm baths and animal furs, brought a kind of frozen peace, a calm born from sheer exhaustion. In the heart of that winter, A simple and unexpected event occurred. Castle Valerian ran out of firewood, for the logistics of cutting and transport had been neglected under the Count's obsession with geometric cartwheels and regulated speed. Master Ambroise, the Chancellor, was forced to confront the Count with the tangible reality of cold, the chill of damp stone and the heavy glacial air that filled the halls now stripped of their comforting fires. For the first time, the threat was real, not symbolic. The cold that seeped through clothing and bone was a more immediate enemy than the purple moss of his dream. The Count, seated on his icy throne, felt the sting of winter air against his face, a sensation that shattered the feverish energy of his paranoia and replaced it with a deep, physical weariness. Theodoric finally realized that he had traded sustenance for superstition and real order for neurosis. The silence that settled over the castle was no longer the tense silence of vigilance, but the stillness of paralysis brought on by starvation and cold. The rattle of the wooden clappers stopped. The mandated candles burned out for lack of tallow. The heavy, nauseating smell of grease was replaced by the clean, cutting scent of ice and cold stone. For a brief moment, the Count allowed himself to contemplate. Through the window, he watched the snow fall again, blanketing the angular wooden pyramid and softening its harsh lines. In that quiet act of nature, he saw a poetic correction to his own absurdity. The law of rigid shapes had been undone by the gentleness of snowflakes, and the hardness of his code was broken by the soft, relentless touch of winter. He remembered the first image from his dream, the slow corrosion. Now he understood that the true corrosion had not come from outside, but from within, born of his own laws, which had eaten away at the social fabric and the health of his people. The weight of guilt pressed more heavily on him than the weight of fear ever had. In an act of silent surrender to reality, Theodoric summoned Master Ambroise and, in a voice weak but finally clear, ordered the immediate suspension of all laws of the Valerian Code, admitting the futility of governing reality through the fear of a dream. The order was simple, without ritual, an acknowledgement that the logic of life must prevail over the madness of authority. When Ambroise heard the command, a faint warmth of hope returned to him. He felt the cold parchment between his fingers and smelled the sharp metallic ink that would record the repeal, a scent that now meant the end of madness. He knew the laws would not vanish overnight. Distrust and fear had sunk deep roots. Yet the permission for reason to breathe again was, in itself, a miracle. The first thing Master Ambroise did was to burn the scrolls of the Valerian Code, using them as the first and only firewood to light the castle hearth. The smell of ink and fine vellum burning was bittersweet, a mix of waste and liberation, and the warmth of the flame, the first true heat in days, felt like the touch of redemption. News of the repeal spread slowly through Aubépine, not with shouts of joy, but with the quiet relief of a burden lifted. The peasants, too weary to celebrate, simply felt the subtle return of freedom in their movements, the permission to walk with lowered heads, to blink slowly, to breathe without fear of absurdity. The touch of normalcy was the greatest grace of all. The revocation of Count Theodoric's laws left behind a reflection on the nature of power and superstition in the Middle Ages. The power of a man, no matter how absolute, is always bound by practicality and by nature's quiet strength, and law, when it strays too far from the logic of life, collapses under the weight of its own absurdity. The sound of the clappers had finally fallen silent, and the windows of the village of Aubépine returned to the natural darkness of night, bathed only in the cold, distant glow of the crescent moon, a stark contrast to the forced brightness of the Edict of Luminosity. In her home, Lisbeth the weaver was at last able to extinguish the tallow candles, and the touch of the cool, clean air on her face, free from the pungent smell of burning fat, brought her both relief and thrift. She allowed herself a moment of intimate silence, no longer tense with the duty to keep the light alive, and for the first time in weeks she could hear the soft, natural murmur of the night breeze, a sound that had long been drowned out by the noise of vigilance. Renard the cooper, now free to tell his son Gervais fantastic tales and old legends after the evening bell, felt the warmth of his child's embrace and the sound of his laughter, simple gestures once forbidden under the law of fear. The smell of freshly cut wood, burning freely in their hearths without fear of fines, replaced the acrid odor of confiscated goods once thrown into the communal fire. It was the smell of comfort restored, of normal life returning. The touch of the fire's heat, the sound of his own voice recounting the tale of a three-headed dragon, these were the sensations of freedom reclaimed. Back at the castle, Master Ambroise watched the burning of the Valerian Code's parchments, the smoke curling up the chimney like a slow exorcism. In the flames, he saw the dissolution of cruel nicknames and senseless decrees. Count Theodoric, seated quietly in his chamber, felt the faint warmth of the only fire still burning, though the cold that gripped him was moral rather than physical, a reflection of the harm his madness had wrought. He thought of Olivier Stump and Gaspar Manco, and the silent burden of knowing he had branded his people with names of shame weighed heavily upon him. The repeal of the laws opened a quiet space for reflection between the recent past and the fragile new present. Theodoric had sought to impose hardness, but true resilience, he now realized, had belonged to the peasants who had endured his absurdities. Slowness was not the enemy, it was the natural rhythm of rural life and contemplation. His frantic haste had only led the kingdom into paralysis. The return to natural order came slowly, but each day was marked by small acts of regained dignity. Villagers began to scrape the lead-grey paint from their house fronts, and the scent of wet lime mixed with that of soil and hay, a fragrance of cleansing and renewal. Rounded objects like ceramic bowls began to reappear, and the smooth, familiar touch of their shapes in people's hands brought a humble comfort, one forbidden for far too long. Through his surrender, Theodoric allowed a poetic farewell to the fear that had ruled him. He came to understand that life need not be governed by angular laws or forbidden colors, but by the softness of nature and human coexistence. He had stared into the abyss of his own mind and, in stepping back, restored his realm to its organic, imperfect cadence. The night silence of Valerian was no longer the silence of law, but the silence of rest. The gentle sounds of life, the purr of a cat, the murmur of quiet conversation, returned, subtle yet powerful reminders of peace. The darkness, once feared by the Count, had become the protective cloak of sleep and intimacy. The feeling of peace and natural closure that enveloped Valerian revealed itself in the slow and gradual return of ancient rhythms. Drinking, once a tense exercise through reed straws, became simple again, the act of lifting a cup. When Theodoric drank a sip of warm wine, he felt the touch of the vessel against his lips and the heat sliding down his throat, a sensory pleasure that his neurosis had long stolen from him. He understood then that dignity lay in the natural gesture, not in forced rigidity, and that the taste of wine was now the taste of humility. Bertrand Ruiveau, the miller, now simply Bertrand the miller, freed from the weight of his humiliating epithet, walked once more at a slow and comfortable pace toward his mill, allowing himself to look down so as not to stumble in the mud. The sound of his steps, unhurried and steady, was the sound of restored health. The touch of the damp earth beneath his feet, visible again without fear, was the touch of his land, not the land of surveillance. Count Theodoric devoted the following days to acts of positive reflection between the madness of the past and the reason of the present. He recalled the image of the children molding square shapes in the snow, the purity of their quiet rebellion, and realized that human creativity will always find a way around the absurdity of law. He finally saw that total control was an illusion, and that true order was born of common sense and necessity. He ordered that the artisans of the village be compensated for the time and materials wasted on angular constructions and small cartwheels, and that Olivier, the blacksmith, be commissioned to forge rounded, functional fences for the castle's fields, a symbol of the restoration of logic and organic form. The smell of fresh iron, forged with purpose rather than paranoia, filled the air of the workshop, an aroma of honest, meaningful labor. In a poetic final act of farewell, the Count walked to the oak wood pyramid at the entrance of the village, the pillar of vigilance, and toppled it with his own hands, helped by his servants. The sound of the angular boards collapsing to the ground was a noise of liberation, and the rough, cold feel of the raw wood was the last physical reminder of his tyranny. He ordered that the timber be used to craft curved benches for the village square, a symbol of restored unity and rest. The story of Valerian's peace and restoration unfolded like the slow mending of a tapestry once torn apart. Master Ambroise, feeling a rare comfort before the warmth of a hearth, now fed by real wood instead of burning parchment, sat down to compose the final decree, the only document that would survive the age of madness, the Edict of Restoration. It was not a law, but a declaration of the return to reason. He inhaled the soft scent of oak smoke and felt the warmth of the quill between his fingers, the touch of purpose restored. His task was to ensure that the memory of absurdity would stand as a lesson, so that the weight of law would never again be imposed by the private fear of a single man. He included within the edict a simple wisdom, that the telling of stories and legends should be encouraged on cold nights, for the Count had come to understand that imagination and narrative were not threats to order, but vital forces for the health of the soul and the unity of the community, the opposite of slowness, the very movement of life itself. Ambroise also decreed the creation of a relief fund for those most harmed by the bans on candles and food, a small act of economic reparation that eased the scent of poverty and the touch of hunger. Olivier, no longer burdened by the surname Stump, could at last devote himself fully to his craft, forging tools once again with the natural curves that honest work required, not the geometric madness of old. The smell of hot metal filled the air, sharp and clean, the fragrance of honesty. Bertrand, the miller, could once again feed his dogs with leavened bread and leftover stew. Their joyful barking and the strong scent of yeast in the air were signs of prosperity, of freedom regained, even for the beasts. A final poetic gesture took shape in the burning of the banned reed straws, once used for drinking. Theodoric ordered them gathered and set aflame in a great fire in the village square, an event the townsfolk watched in quiet relief. The smell of dry straw burning, the crackle of wood, these were the kingdom's final purification, an olfactory and auditory release from control. From his window, the Count looked down upon Aubépine, and saw not the rigid geometry of vigilance, but the living complexity of real life. Smoke from countless hearths mingling in the air, the rhythmic sound of hammers striking alongside a distant song, the touch of colorful and varied fabrics on his people, a harmony of disorder, a richness of human texture. The tale of the Valerian Code lived on not as a trauma, but as a moral parable, a warning about laws born of fear and the need to preserve common sense. The only true law, people would say, was the unchanging rhythm of nature and the quiet necessity of coexistence. Master Ambroise, seated at his desk, now free from the watchful eyes of young Elias, devoted himself to recording the details of the days of madness, not to preserve the laws, but to chronicle the fragility of the human mind. He breathed in the scent of new parchment, a fragrance he hoped would never again carry the weight of absurdity. In careful lines, he documented the Edict of Restoration, ensuring that compensation was paid to all who had been forced to waste their beeswax, their dark foods, and their labor, an act of justice that restored the community's balance. He observed Lisbeth the weaver, at home, undoing the bright, uncomfortable patches of her old garments. She stitched the wool back into a soft, natural tone, gentler to the eye and the touch. The freedom to wear the color of humility and practicality was, to a medieval peasant woman, the truest elegance. She ran her hands across the pure wool, feeling its soft warmth, and the clean scent of the fabric filled her home, the aroma of dignity restored. Count Theodoric, in moments of solitude, reflected on the metaphor of slowness he had once feared so much. He saw now that the slowness of nature, the steady rhythm of weaving, planting, and cooking, was the true strength that sustained the realm, and that haste was the real degeneration. He began to practice small acts of stillness, watching the hearth's flames with calm, feeling the cold touch of stone walls without fear, and learning to accept quietude. The dominant sound in Aubépine became once again the sound of life in harmony. The songs of birds, once forbidden from mingling with the noise of labor, now blended freely with the rhythmic hammering of Olivier's forge and the creak of Bertrand's mill. It was a rustic symphony, a celebration of coexistence and balance. In the years that followed, Theodoric devoted himself to ruling with logic and practicality. The only thing he no longer allowed was the needless interruption of his people's sleep or rest, a quiet reflection of his final understanding of peace. He became, in his own way, a ruler of serenity. The last lesson of his nightmare was simple and profound. The true strength of a kingdom lies not in control, but in the acceptance of life's natural rhythm. The final message that settled over Valerian was not about the power of a king, but about the resilience of the human spirit. The story proved that even at the highest peak of feudal authority, irrationality was unsustainable, and absurdity always collapsed beneath the weight of practical reality. Count Theodoric became a gentler, quieter ruler, always attentive to the natural sounds and scents of his realm, knowing that calm and slow movement were the truest guarantees of stability. The village of Aubépine and the county of Valerian slowly returned to their rightful place in time, a small fragment of the Middle Ages where the greatest danger was not the invader, but the disturbed mind at the summit of power. The touch of simple life, with all its imperfections and natural rhythms, became the only lasting law, a silent lesson in the failure of rules born from fear. Theodoric never dreamed of the purple moss again, and the chapel bells that marked the curfew once more became an invitation to peace and sleep, not to vigilance. The night in Valerian was, at last, a place of rest. Until tomorrow, traveler, I'll be here waiting to journey with you through these forgotten ages once more. You already know where to find me, right here between history and dream. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and rest well, dear traveler.